and settle there. Build an altar to me, to the God who appeared to you when you ran away from your brother Esau." Jacob told his household and those with him to get ready to move. Jacob says, "Get rid of any foreign gods you had in your possession. Purify yourselves, bathe, and change your clothes. Then come with me. We're going to Bethel so I can build an altar there to the God who answers me whenever I'm in distress, and who is with me wherever I go." So they handed over to Jacob all of the foreign gods they had, as well as the rings in their ears. Jacob buried them in the shadow of a mighty oak that was near Shechem. As they traveled, God struck terror into the hearts of all the cities along the way, so no one pursued Jacob's family. Jacob and all those who were with him arrived in Luz, which is also known as Bethel, in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God had revealed himself to Jacob when he was running away from his brother. Along the way, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and they buried her under the branches of a stately oak below Bethel. Since that day, it has been known as Alan-Baku, which means oak of weeping. Now that Jacob had come back from Padan-aram, God appeared to him again at Bethel and blessed him. And God said to Jacob, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be known as Jacob. Israel will be your name." From then on, God addressed him by his new name, Israel. "I am the God all-powerful. Be fruitful and multiply. You will give rise to a great nation. Indeed, nation after nation will come from you. Kings and rulers will be numbered among your descendants. Your children will one day possess the land I promised to Abraham and Isaac."
And continuing on in verse 13. Then God ascended from the place where he had spoken with Jacob, and Jacob set up a pillar of stone in that same spot. He poured wine on it as an offering to God and doused it with oil. Jacob named this place where God had spoken with him Bethel. After that, they traveled on from Bethel. While still a long way from Ephrath, Rachel began having labor pains, and it was a hard labor. And when the labor pains were most intense, the midwife tried to comfort her. "Don't be afraid. You're going to have another son." But as her life slipped away, just before she died, Rachel named her son Ben-Oni. But his father decided to call him Benjamin instead. So Rachel died, and they buried her on the way to Ephrath, which is also known as Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar to mark Rachel's tomb, and the pillar at her tomb still stands to this day. Israel then continued on the journey, and he pitched his tent beyond the tower of Peguer. During the time Israel lived in this land, Reuben slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Israel found out about it. Now, Jacob, Israel, had 12 sons. Leah's 6 sons were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Rachel's 2 sons were Joseph and Benjamin. Rachel's servant Bilhah had 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah's servant Zilpah had 2 sons, Gad and Asher. These were the sons born to Jacob in Padan-aram and on the journey home. Jacob finally arrived at his father Isaac's house at Mamre, not far from Kiriath Arba, which is also known as Hebron. This is where Abraham and Isaac had resided as foreigners. Isaac lived 180 years. By the time that he took his last breath and joined his ancestors in death, he had reached a ripe old age and lived a full life. His sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
What is home? What is home? The saying goes, home is where the heart is. Home is where your family is at. This past weekend, my wife and I traveled back to my home to see my family, my parents, and we got to see my brother and sister-in-law as well. Tomorrow, my wife and I will be traveling to go see her family for an entire week. An entire week. There's something about going home that just creates a certain level of excitement. I don't know if you live far away from where you grew up, where your home is at, but even if you're traveling, you're on vacation and you're coming home, you're at work and you're coming home, there's a certain amount of excitement and anticipation and anxiety and giddiness almost that happens inside of you as you're going home. Jacob is finally going home. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 35, and we're going to touch on Genesis 36 because it gives a few extra details that I'm going to touch on, but not too heavily. So, real quick, we'll take a congregational vote. Is it okay that I cover 2 chapters of Genesis? All good? All in favor? Aye? Okay, good. Genesis chapter 35. Then God said to Jacob. Now, Jacob, everybody say Jacob. Jacob. Good. Jacob is a character that we've been following for a long time, right? We've been following his family. We followed his grandpa Abraham forever, it seems like. And then we followed Jacob's dad, Isaac, for a little while. And then we started following Jacob himself. Jacob, you remember, had a terrible home life. Mom and dad playing favorites. There was some competition, some threats, some rivalry between the 2 brothers, Jacob and Esau. Everybody say Esau? Esau. And so, everybody say Esau? Esau. And so Jacob and Esau didn't necessarily get along in early goings, and so Jacob was sent away because he was scared for his life, because he needed to find a wife. That wasn't supposed to rhyme, but it did. And so Jacob, he travels. And you'll remember, he gets to a certain spot after a day of running away from home, essentially, and he lays down and he has a nap. He sleeps for the night, and he has a dream. And in this dream, you'll remember he sees a staircase, a giant ladder, leading from the earth up to heaven. And it has angels going up and down the staircase, up and down. He wakes up and he says, surely God is in this place, and I wasn't aware of it. And he names the place Bethel, the place where his pillow becomes a pillar. And Jacob, he moves on. He finds a wife, you'll remember, from far distant relatives, and he falls in love with this woman named Rachel. Everybody say Rachel. Rachel. Rachel was lovely, it says. And so he fell in love with her, and in order to win her hand in marriage, her brother says, you can marry her as long as you work for 7 years. 7 years. How many people were engaged for 7 years? That's what I thought. Okay. It's a long time, right? And so Jacob, he doesn't care because he's so in love with her. And each day is like a passing blink. It goes so fast. And so he agrees. And after that 7 years, they have this big wedding celebration. And the next morning, Jacob wakes up only to discover that he's married her sister. And that's quite a shock. Jacob is upset. He goes to the father, and the father says, well, yeah, we don't give away the younger daughters first. You got to marry the other one. But I tell you what, if you really want to marry Rachel, agree to work for another 7 years, and then you can marry her. And so he does. 14 years to win the hand of one woman. Jacob ends up sticking around an extra 6 years, trying to escape his father-in-law, but he just keeps working and gaining property and gaining resources and gaining flocks and herds, and eventually, after 20 years, everybody say 20 years? 20 years. 20 years of doing all this work for his father-in-law, he finally steals away in the night. And in fact, his wife Rachel, she steals her father's household gods. Remember this, if you do, nod your head. Okay? Steals her father's household gods, and Dad comes chasing after him after a few days, catches up and says, Jacob, why did you just leave? You took my children, you took my grandchildren, and why did you steal my idols? What was the deal with that? Jacob didn't know Rachel had taken them, and so he says, oh. And Laban, he looks around, he can't find the idols, and so he goes back home and they go their separate ways. Jacob is feeling good about this. God has told him to go home, and so Jacob is trotting towards home, but you'll remember he has a brother who wasn't too fond of him 20 years ago. And so Jacob hears that this brother is off in the distance with 400 men. Everybody say 400 men. 400 men. This is just a chapter review. There will be a quiz. 400 men. And Jacob is scared because this guy threatened to kill him 20 years ago, and now he has an army. And so Jacob, he does what he did best. He begins plotting and scheming and organizing. All right, you group, you go up in front. This group, you go up here. And Rachel and the boys, you stay back here and I'll hide in the back. That's how it will work. And that night, Jacob wrestles with a man, it says. And he wrestles with him all night. And Jacob gets his hip thrown out of socket. Did you like that little Elvis thing? He gets his hip thrown out of socket, and Jacob is all goofed up. And the guy tries to leave, and Jacob says, no, I want you to bless me. I've worked too hard for this. I've struggled too long with this. And the guy says, well, I tell you what, I'll give you a new name. Your name is no longer Jacob the schemer, Jacob the heel grabber, Jacob the clever fox. Your name is Israel, the one who has struggled with God and with man and was victorious. And so Jacob starts towards home. But you'll remember, Jacob hasn't fully embraced this new identity that God gave him. He actually starts towards home, but he stops and he settles and he buys property. And last week, we learned that choices have consequences. And it was a terrible thing that happened to one of Jacob's daughters. And as we learned, revenge always escalates. Everybody say revenge always escalates. Revenge always escalates. And so, terrible things happened. An entire city was slaughtered by Jacob's sons. And Jacob says, this is bad. Why did you do this? Now we have to go. And in Genesis chapter 35, are you still with me? Okay. Genesis 35, verse 1, it says, Then God said to Jacob, Go up to Bethel and settle there. Build an altar to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you. Purify yourselves and change your clothes. So Jacob is finally going home. Finally, God has said, you need to go. And he says, you're right, I do. And so it's great to see Jacob actually take charge, the one who is known for hiding and scheming and running. He turns to his family and he says, listen, because of everything that God has done for us, we have to act. So we need to get rid of all these things. We need to get rid of these foreign idols. We need to get rid of the stench of where we've been. And we need to get rid of these clothes. We don't need to be reminded of our past failures. And so the people, they give Jacob all their foreign idols that they had. Not just the ones that they had stolen from dear old dad, but other ones that they had acquired from the people in the area. So they give them all to Jacob. And it says they gave him their earrings and their nose rings as well. Now, not that there's anything wrong with earrings or nose rings, but in those days, they were fashioned to be symbols of the cultic, to be symbols of these foreign gods. And so, if you worship the moon god, you would have little crescent moon earrings. Or if you worship the sun god, you would have little sun earrings. And so, they gave all these things that represented this false religion. They gave it to Jacob and said, take it. And Jacob takes the foreign idols, he takes the rings, and he buries them. All the trustees held their breath. He buries them in the shadow of the oak of Shechem. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but in Genesis chapter 12, when God tells Abraham to leave and start to travel, Abraham's first altar is near the oak at Shechem. And so, Jacob buries these idols. Now, I don't know if you noticed in Genesis 35, but that word buries shows up a few times. It's a major theme in Genesis 35. And so our first burial is these idols, these earrings. It's a doing away with. That actual first word of burial for the idols and earrings, it's different than the other three in the original language. The first one has the idea of hiding, removing from sight, getting rid of. Jacob doesn't want anybody to discover these. It's like, I am ashamed of this. I don't want anything to do with it. I'm going to put it away. No more comparing ourselves to everybody else. No more looking at how everybody else is doing and saying, that seems to be better than this. No more trying to find where the grass is greener, only to discover that it's astroturf. It's fake. It doesn't taste very good. There's no real nutritional value there. What is it that you need to bury in order to go home? What is home, after all? Home is where memories are made, right? I remember, what do I remember? I remember waking up on Saturday morning at about 7 o'clock, and I would tiptoe down the hallway, and I knew exactly where the creepy spots were, and I would avoid those. It was very sneaky. I'd turn on the television, and I'd hurry and turn it down, just in case it was on. And I'd sit there and watch the 2-hour block of cartoons that was from 7 to 9 o'clock on Saturday mornings. Then I graduated high school. I remember riding four-wheelers when we first got the property in the country, and the grass and the weeds and everything had just grown up, and so it was, no joke, 5-6 feet tall. And I'm riding four-wheelers in 5 to 6 feet of weeds. You can't see anything. And I'm just flying. I remember sitting around the table and playing games, lots and lots of board games. Home is where memories are made. The second burial that is mentioned in Genesis 35 is of a woman named Deborah. Verse 8, Genesis 35, it says, "Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Bethel." So it was named Alan Lakuth. And that's it. A woman named Deborah. Rebekah's nurse. Do you remember Rebekah? Rebekah was Jacob's mom. Way back when Father Abraham had many sons. His first real son of Sarah was named Isaac. Everybody say Isaac.
Isaac.
And Isaac needed a wife. And so Abraham sent a messenger to go find a wife. You remember this. If you do, nod your head like a bobblehead. There you go. And Isaac needed a wife. And so Abraham sent a servant to go find one. And he found this woman who was going to water all of his camels. And Rebekah's heart was so good. And so he said, "Rebekah, you need to come home. You need to marry my master." When Isaac saw her coming across the field, doves flew and the symphony started up, and it was love at first sight. Rebekah, you'll remember, was Jacob's mom. And not just that, but she was the mom of Jacob. Now, I told you that there was some favoritism in Jacob's household, right? Isaac, Jacob's dad, he favored Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. And so it's very possible that this Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, would have been Jacob's nanny. She would have been the one responsible for making sure he was dressed on time and helping Rebekah with any household things that she needed. She would help babysit if necessary. And so she probably knew things about Jacob that not even Rebekah knew. Fun little things that they shared. Secrets, stories. And we don't know exactly when Deborah decided to join Jacob's group. But at some point she did.
And I can imagine that first night after not seeing each other for so many years. There's always